Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I'm Ed Jeredjian, the director of the Institute. Last year, our Institute commemorated our 25th anniversary under the theme, A Quarter Century Making History. Throughout those years, we built research programs which have been recognized as valuable nonpartisan, and I stress the word nonpartisan, resources for policymakers and the public at large to engage with critical local, national, and global public policy issues. Today's event is brought to you by one of the Baker Institute's long-standing and important programs, namely the China Studies Program. We founded this program over 20 years ago, and it continues to explore China's place in an increasingly transnational world. This afternoon, we look forward to an engaging discussion on China's future, one that is quite timely given recent controversy surrounding China's domestic and foreign policy. China has faced international scrutiny for its treatment of ethnic minorities such as the Uyghurs. Protests in Hong Kong have underscored widespread popular discontent among its residents toward what is seen as the Chinese Communist Party's overreach into the territory's affairs. At the same time, in the midst of a trade war between China and the United States and concerns about the scope of Chinese technological and economic influence, one cannot discuss political reform in China without examining the complex dynamic in the U.S.-Chinese relationship. Today's panel is moderated by Dr. Steve Lewis, the C.V. Starr Transnational China Fellow here at our Institute, as well as a professor in the practice and associate director of Rice University's Chao Center for Asian Studies. Steve has led our China program from the very outset and has done an outstanding job. So we'd like to thank Steve and our three expert panelists for making this event possible. So please join me in welcoming Steve Lewis.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for your support. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. As I'm sure you all know, China is very much in the news, and so I think that explains why we have a very good turnout. I just want to say a few words of introduction, because this is, I believe, our 6th year of doing a panel on political reform in China, and our goal is to try to showcase Texas talent in particular, so inviting colleagues from Rice University, other universities in Houston and around the state to come down and share their expertise on different aspects that help us understand reform in China and what kind of motivates it, whether it's international or whether it's domestic factors that are playing a role. About 20 years ago, when we first formed the program, there was very little movement across borders going into China. Today, there's hundreds of thousands, probably millions of foreigners living and working in China. So and in fact, many of our Asian studies majors aspire to go live and work in China, doing everything from research to professional jobs. And so it seems altogether appropriate that our first speaker, Dr. Chuk, who is a postdoc at the Chao Center for Asian Studies, should talk to us about kind of immigration and transnational labor flows. In ways that are completely unexpected 20 years ago. Our second speaker, Dr. Carrie Leo Currier from Texas Christian up in Fort Worth, has come down once again to share her expertise. And this time she's talking about a topic that is very near and dear to my own heart as a fellow political scientist. But in talking about civil society in China, it really brought me back to thinking about the 1990s when we started this project, and everything seemed to be moving in the direction of reform. Things were getting more and more liberal. The party was loosening up in many, many ways, and yet since 2012, it seems to be going the other direction. And in fact, about 10 years ago, we had scholars from Chinese think tanks here, and one of them, a very prominent scholar, I won't mention his name because I don't want to get him in trouble, he actually talked about civil society in China. That is not allowed today. Scholars in China are not allowed to talk about civil society because it implies that the party is making a big mistake and not representing the people properly. So we're looking forward to Dr. Carrie Leo Currier's presentation. And finally, as well, there's always implications for the United States right? And 20 years ago, nobody, I think, would have thought of China as a superpower, and yet very much so today. The American military and government is focused on China as an emerging superpower, and particularly in certain areas of the world, including the South China Sea. And so Dan Katz, a newly minted PhD from Nanyang Tech, who's an expert on security diplomacy and defense diplomacy and U.S. China relations, will be sharing his thoughts. And before I just ask you to help welcome them, I just kind of talk a little bit about the format. So I'm going to ask each one of them to present for about 20 minutes. Please hold your questions unless it's just a question of clarification. And then after all three are finished, we'll have a good 40-45 minutes where we can ask questions from the audience. And we'll all sit down here and talk about who can best answer your questions. But it's usually quite lively. And then after that, we can adjourn for outside. We've got some food, some fine food and snacks for you to have and to chat informally with our speakers. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. So Dr. Chook, would you like to begin? And if you want to go ahead and sit.
So thank you very much. Thank you for Professor Steve Levis for his very kind introductions and his invitation for me to join today's panel. I would also like to thank my colleagues here at the Baker Institute for Public Policy, who have done some amazing job in organizing these panel discussions. It is my great honor to present some of my anthropological observations on the current political reforms in China. Today, I'm going to talk about a very specific aspect of political reforms in China, which is the ongoing, but still quite silent, I would say, policy reforms on the international migration management in China over the last 20 years. As an anthropologist of migrations, I think it's important for us to understand and to learn something about the immigration policy in China. Not just because my presentation can sort of tell you what kind of visa you should apply when you go to China, or how you can emigrate to China if you want to be a foreign immigrant in China. But rather, I believe that the immigration reforms is a very important topic in the current studies of contemporary Chinese society because it offers us a very unique lens to capture and analyze the political and social developments of China, not only at the present, but also in the future of China, say like in the next 10 to 40 decades. And my presentation today will be given in the following orders. In part A, I will give a historical overview of the immigration reform that took place in the 1980s, 1990s, and the 2000s. It showed that immigration was only a very marginal issue in the national reform during this period of time. But nonetheless, I will show how such long importance of immigration reform has rather quite indirectly encouraged more transient migrations to China, particularly those from the global south. I will also talk about the unique role played by Hong Kong in this wave of transient migrations. In part B, I will talk about how immigrations began to enter the mainstream of politics and political reforms in China since 2012, and how the immigration reform has been structurally incorporated into the broader agenda of future-oriented development in China since 2012. In part C, I will end my presentations by discussing how such incorporations can, quite paradoxically I would say, divert our policy attentions away from the most serious issues that still wait to be solved. That is, the rapidly aging Chinese society in the near future of China. I will also talk about how a migration perspective would offer us an alternative way to think about the current political crisis in Hong Kong. So part A. From the 1980s to the 2000s, there were only a few reforms that aimed to change the immigration laws, policies, and regulations in China. In 1985, China adopted the law of the People's Republic of China on control of the entry and exit of aliens. It is the first time for China to create a visa system that aimed to facilitate more foreigners to visit China for tourism, business, study, and other non-immigration-related activities, which was not so possible during the socialist period of time. This visa system had not been changed too much until 2012. In 2004, China introduced a green card immigration system. Under this system, China, for the very first time, allows foreigners to apply for permanent residency in China. But however, the actual impact of such policy has been so far quite insignificant, I would argue. This is because only a very small number of foreigners can meet the extremely high requirement of the green card applications. As a result, the number of foreigners of holding permanent residency in China is still very, very small. From 2004 to 2011, only 1,700 foreigners successfully got the green cards in China. So without a strong force of immigration reforms from the Chinese central government, I would argue that the implementations of immigration laws, regulations, and management have been quite inconsistent and loose in different parts of China from the 1980s to the 2000s. One would argue that the immigration policy during that time were quite underdeveloped. But precisely because of such underdevelopment, there were places where migration was very easy and easier than in other areas. And foreigners could still live and work in China as long as they could renew their short-term Chinese visa. Basically, it has created a group of what I call transient migrants, who become the majority of foreign populations in China since that time. For people having no chance to become permanent residents, while having a strong need and desire to live and work in China, the easiest, cheapest, and the most convenient way was to get a tourist visa, or if they have more money to pay more, a business visa. For both kinds of visa, Hong Kong has played quite a significant role. Foreigners holding a tourist visa need to leave China every 1 to 3 months. But the foreigners can always re-enter China right after leaving the Chinese borders. This is the way to get another 1 to 3 months of stay in China. So crossing the Hong Kong-China borders for this purpose is quite common, especially among the foreign traders based in Guangzhou, Shenzhen, or other parts of southern China. Foreigners holding a business visa need to have an offshore bank account and an offshore company registrations. They can easily buy one from Hong Kong, even if they are not doing any actual business in Hong Kong. So given that the migration cost was relatively low and the process of getting the Chinese visas was not so difficult, China has attracted a large number of transient migrants from South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa during that time. Most of them are not very skilled, and only a few of them have money to start a very established business. So most of them are individual entrepreneurs or small business persons. But nonetheless, they are usually very entrepreneurial and transnationally well connected with various buyer markets all around the world. And most of them come from South Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. And this is what scholars would call part of the global South, or some old scholars would call it like third world or developing countries. These foreigners from the global South have brought with them transnational trade network, which has become a key driver in some regional economies in China, particularly in the small Chinese cities and counties that are specialized in the productions and trade of small, cheap, and low-quality products for the global market. African traders in Guangzhou is a very good example. In 2008, as an anthropologist, Gordon Matthews estimated, around 20% mobile phones used in sub-Saharan Africa came from China through Hong Kong, in which cross-border trade has been mostly conducted by African traders based in Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Another example is based on my long-term ethnographic fieldwork since 2009. This is about the Indian textile traders in Keqiao in Zhejiang province. Keqiao is the key trading hub for the global textile trade because over 30% of the made-in-China fabrics has been traded in Keqiao, and over half of it has been exported to more than 200 ports around the world. Many of the trade has been conducted by the Indian traders who are very active in the Middle East buyer market. Thousands of Indian traders are now based in Keqiao as business visa holders. They usually get the visa by having the Hong Kong bank account and the Hong Kong company registrations. So now part B. While the foreign immigrations in China before 2012 is characterized by the policy underdevelopment and the lack of attentions from Communist Party's political leaders and policymakers, the situation after 2012 is a completely different story. The adoptions of exit entry administration law and the administrative regulations of the People's Republic of China on the entry and exit of aliens in 2012 marked a very important watershed, because that was the first time that the central government of China considered that the previous immigration system, which had been operating quite effectively for over 20 years, was now inadequate. Since then, the central government has enforced a series of top-down immigration policy reform, obviously having changed its approach on immigration governance and immigration management. And quite remarkably, this reform had been undertaken with the expert advices and policy recommendations offered by scholars, researchers, and think tanks. They all advocate that immigrations become an increasingly urgent matter for China, which would largely define the future of China in the next 10 to 40 years. And it is illustrated by this map on the slide. One of the major arguments made by the academics and the think tank is that the social and political impact of Chinese population aging, mostly due to the one-child policy, will be much more extreme in China than in the West or even in Japan and Korea. That means, due to the foreseeable labor shrinkage, rapidly aging populations, and highly sketched gender ratio, China will not be able to sustain growth in its economy and populations unless there is a substantial foreign immigration from outside. As such, the scholars and the think tanks make a very, very strong argument that the immigration reform should now be seen as an urgent issue that needs to be more incorporated into the mainstream of the Chinese politics and the Chinese policy making. This strong argument has been quite well taken by the central government of China in recent years. The Center for China and Globalizations, CCG, is a leading think tank based in Beijing. CCG has played a very influential role in the recent immigration reform in China, as I will show in the following slides. The policy recommendations made by CCG were one of the main drivers of China's late admissions as the 165th official member of the International Organization for Migrations, IOM, in the United Nations in 2017, and the establishment of National Immigration Administrations, NIA, under the Public Security Bureau in 2018. China have been reluctant to join IOM for a very, very long time, and NIA is the first ever department of the Chinese government that is specialized in the immigration management and the immigration governance. Before that, migration management was handled by several government departments that often create overlapping functions and inconsistency on policy implementations and law enforcement. So in this way, CCG, as a think tank in China, has been quite successful in convincing the Communist Party leaders that they should take a more interventionist approach in immigration governance within and beyond the borders of China. And now, Part C. The Chinese government is now more confident to make foreign immigration manageable. In many ways, China is taking the same path as many Western countries have done before. That is, to establish a set of criteria that make foreign immigrants or foreign migrants' skills and knowledge become measurable in relation to their perceived contributions to China's overall development. The recent introductions of the point-based immigration system in China is just one of the many examples in recent immigration reforms in China. But however, this kind of reform, which is largely based on the existing Western model of immigration control and immigration management, mostly focus on increasing the effectiveness of law enforcement. This is particularly the case in China because NIA, the National Immigration Administration, is under the Public Security Bureau, and all NIA officers are actually police officers. So actually it does not quite address the most pressing issues that is unique in a very specific context of China. That is, China will need to import substantial number of foreign immigrants, regardless of their skill level, in order to deal with the social and political challenges that are going to be caused by the rapidly aging Chinese society. Obviously, the import of small numbers of migrants would not help solve these structural problems in the near and distant future of immigrations in China. As it seems, China may actually need more young migrants from South Asia, from the Middle East, from Africa, even if they are unskilled labor migrants. So it is expected that China still needs to find a more radical way to reform its immigration policy over a longer term. And I would like to end my presentation today by offering the migration perspective on the recent political crisis in Hong Kong. I have learned this perspective from my Indian informants in China, who told me that how they, Indians, as transient migrants in China, number one, and number two, people from the global south, think of the political crisis ongoing in Hong Kong. One of the major arguments that have been supported by not just some protesters in Hong Kong, but also the pro-Hong Kong government people, is that Hong Kong should keep its unique status as a global city with its unique legal and financial system, which is different from those in the mainland China. Local people in Hong Kong who support this argument tend to think that an independent legal and financial system is the key to the long-term prosperity of Hong Kong economy. Interestingly, some Indian traders in Kertao, in my field site in China, also support this kind of argument, but from a very different kinds of reasonings. That is, as a business visa holders in China, on paper, as I mentioned in the early part of the presentation, they are operating their business in Hong Kong on paper, but actually they are doing their business operation in China. So on paper and in practice, it's totally different story. And Hong Kong, as such, has played a very important role in facilitating their transient migration to China, because only Hong Kong remains, as long as Hong Kong keeps its independent financial and political system, the Indian traders, the African traders, the Middle Eastern traders can still make use of the system to get a cheap, low-cost business visa to keep their China business going on as usual. So they don't really want Hong Kong to lose its unique and special status. In other words, they are quite afraid that Hong Kong and China would become just the same, because it means there will be even less institutional flexibility for the low-skilled foreign migrants to navigate in the Chinese visa system. And so in this way, it may be said that the political stability in Hong Kong is equally important to the Western multinational corporations as to the sojourning diasporic traders from the global South. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Good job. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chook. Now we'd like to ask Dr. Carrie Leo-Courier to come up and give her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you again for having me. I wanted to give a little explanation about my title. You always try to think you come up with these clever titles, but then when they need explanation, you don't think they're so clever anymore. Civil society, we know, is the ability for groups to organize independently and outside of the state. But civil society with Chinese characteristics is a way to understand how the Chinese often characterize what they do as being relatively unique or different. And so when we look at economic reform from 1978 and beyond, it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's the Chinese version of socialism, which we actually just call capitalism. But socialism or civil society with Chinese characteristics is how we can understand how China is trying to blend together these notions of civil society with their unique kind of system. And so there are a lot of interesting issues that are impacting China today. And as the ambassador mentioned in the introduction, there's a lot of attention being paid to how China treats its minorities, and particularly the various protests that are going on in Hong Kong. And so it raises a bunch of questions about how an authoritarian regime like China's can continue to exist, and in particular, how it is becoming more authoritarian and how that resonates with how we look at civil society. It's also interesting because as we see these global trends to a decrease in authoritarianism globally and an increase in democratization movements, this presents a unique challenge for China to deal with. Before I get to that, though, I wanted to, let's see if I can get this. I wanted to at least put it in the context of understanding what has just happened. So for those of you who follow Chinese domestic politics, the Communist Party has a variety of different plenums that meet, and the fourth plenum just finished on Thursday. And so this is an opportunity for top Chinese party officials to come together to forge consensus on various things moving forward when it comes to Chinese policy. And in that, the theme is called Socialism with Chinese Characteristics and Modernization. You can argue that's China's theme song in general for the last 40 years. But the elements that are relevant to look at related to civil society come from the communique that was issued that look at the development of a sound legal system, particularly in reference to the special administrative regions, looking at safeguarding national security, and in enhancing nationalist education. And if you look at these three components, what it argues is that you have to have a basis for the parameters in which citizens are to operate. There are means for punishment, so the safeguarding of the national security is about law enforcement. And the third component is how you can basically re-educate. So enhancing nationalist education to get people back on par with the song the party wants you to sing. And so in light of these issues, it's important to look at how civil society is developing. So if we look at the modern authoritarian state and just sort of the basics of understanding authoritarianism, that the components that we see worldwide include the concentrated and centralized power with basically no challengers. And with that, we see that you have, sometimes you have components that look like they'd be semi-democratic. You've got constitutions that may exist, you have parties, you have elections, but you really don't have a real challenge to the regime that is in place. In addition, that regime is fortified by the use of coercion and the co-optation of civil society, so not allowing civil society to exist outside of state parameters. The characteristics that we see, again, typical of authoritarian regimes, and China's no exception, is to look at the various characteristics like censorship, so censorship of the media, looking at things like surveillance. The surveillance of the population has become increasingly of interest given the variety of ways that biometrics have been used, particularly in the Chinese context, and some of the concerns that that raises. And looking at organizational restrictions. So again, you don't want to be able to allow for protest and dissent to occur because largely the state itself, when it's operating in an authoritarian system, does not necessarily have the kind of legitimacy that you would like it to have by having the vote of the people. So China really is a consultative authoritarian system or fragmented authoritarian system. Now I'm using all of these big words to try to basically say it's unique. And the ways that it's unique is that when we look at sort of the modern authoritarian state, so post-Mao, post-Deng Xiaoping, it really isn't one where you have this iconic leader that rules without any sort of need to formulate consensus. And so there actually are a lot of factions that exist within the Communist Party and differences that exist when you're looking at domestic politics. So it isn't quite the same sort of authoritarian system that we necessarily think from the outside. So it's a consultative authoritarian system. We'll call this China authoritarianism 2.0. However, when we look at 2012 and beyond, we have a changing system. And that changing system, I'm just going to consider Xi Jinping unlimited. And so when you've looked at some of the ways that the Chinese system has changed, these are the things that have been characteristic of Xi Jinping's time. And that is that he has worked on targeting corruption. And targeting corruption actually has two interesting components to it. One, it's a way to gain popular support in trying to show that you're basically trying to root out both the tigers and flies. I'm using all these good Chinese phrases. The tigers and flies are both the big and then the small kind of corrupt individuals. So nobody's outside of the realm of being investigated. In addition, targeting corruption also allows you to eliminate potential rivals. So it serves a double purpose in that respect. Term limits were abolished, we know, last year, and as a result, Xi Jinping has an unlimited time that he can serve in office. Maybe it's a little bit overstated, but unlimited amount of time that he can serve. And so again, it gives you a sense of that increasing element of no challengers and unlimited power. In addition, you have the heightened security state. And this is something even the average person who goes to China has seen over the last 3 or 4 years in particular. Every time you go, it has become increasingly more difficult and increasingly more of a security state. You see a much larger military or police presence. You see a lot more challenges getting in even to basic places like Tiananmen Square. And so the things that we look at over time have increased a sense of a security state where you did not necessarily see that before. In addition, again, I can't reiterate enough the element of the biometrics and cameras that really give a sense of being watched, the average person being watched, whereas before, really there was a sense only if you were some sort of political dissident would there be a need to really investigate you and keep track of you very closely. In addition to the heightened security state then, we've seen crackdowns on threats to the national interest. And the national interest, of course, is broadly defined. So these vague terms are often used to give political cover for the state to decide when it determines there is a national interest at stake. And so these crackdowns are things that we've seen against a variety of different groups over time. So what we see now in 2012 and beyond, it really is a consolidation of power and what you might consider authoritarian revival. And I wouldn't actually call it China 2.5, I'd call it China 1.0 again. And here's why. You have the idea of what we consider to be a personalist regime. And so I'm going back to Mao to look at the Little Red Book, studying Maoist ideology and learning the good ways of the Communist Party and really having a focus centered around Mao as a leader himself. And now we have Xuexi. So Xuexi Changguo is the study great nation idea that individuals should study up hard. And Xuexi, the Chinese are great at doing plays on words. So Xuexi is the study, but it also can be to study Xi Jinping. And so we have, in the past you had the Little Red Book in paper form and you had these ideas of Mao, and now we have our cell phone apps and the study of Xi Jinping. And so if you've looked at the app, there are more than 100 million downloads, and on the app it gives you opportunities to learn all about Xi Jinping thought, and various communist slogans that could help you become a better citizen. In fact, this program was mandated for many officials to learn more and to prove that they are patriotic. You could go ahead and send your friends your quiz scores. You could go ahead and take pictures of various things to prove that you had met these levels of patriotism. And so it really emphasizes the nationalistic sense, but it's still focused on a personalist regime. And these are ways we see authoritarianism moving from a 2.0 back to 1.0, where it really is about a personalist regime. And these we don't see very much globally anymore. So there's this challenge in this puzzle, and that is, how do authoritarian regimes survive? And in particular, when we start understanding the global context in which democratization has become, and democracy movements have become more prevalent since the Arab Spring, we see the threats of color revolutions, And we see the challenges that states have in trying to regulate social media and monitoring its citizens, and yet China has this authoritarian resilience. And so we've moved from, as was mentioned before in the introduction, we've moved from having what we thought was going to be a less authoritarian state and a more liberal state to one that has become increasingly more authoritarian under Xi Jinping. The next part of the puzzle then is, how does civil society fit in? And so when we look at the various components of civil society, sometimes the message is a little bit confusing. So in the sense of increased authoritarianism, we also see the growth in civil society organizations. And that continues on beyond the 2014 range. And so you see the number of civil society organizations increases. We see a lot of different domestic threats to the state that have been identified in the post-2012 and even before then. So the last one is one that we're quite familiar with, right? So political activists are, of course, going to be threats to the state. But some of these others have become increasingly interesting. So ethnic minorities, of course, we see in the news more recently. Human rights lawyers, probably not surprising. Feminist activists, labor activists, used to be able to exist in a little bit more space before, but since 2015, that space has shrunk considerably. Feminists actually present an interesting challenge to the state for a variety of reasons. It goes back to the idea that women hold up half the sky. And so when you think of what are women's interests, it's half the population. And so that does pose a threat when you consider the mass numbers of individuals and that their interests actually cross over into a variety of different areas, whether it's labor, whether it might be environmental issues, or a variety of other things. And of course, labor activists. We've seen a lot of the attention that's paid to the rise of civil society in China has been over small-scale labor activist activities or environmental activists. So these are the different kinds of domestic threats to the state that we see. But the question then is, when is civil society going to be permitted? And so we do see that there is a small space. So I don't want us to go away thinking that there's no space for civil society. There's a small space. But when you study civil society, you have to figure out just how small the space is and how much smaller it's getting. So when we look at when civil society is permitted, we do see that it is permitted when there are localized concerns. If there's a local situation, if there's a local environmental movement, if there's a local labor problem, if there's a very localized issue. And these often tend to be policy-oriented, looking at the outcomes or looking at a very specific situation. So they're not about the process. Ultimately, they're not going to be threats to the regime's legitimacy because they're small scale. And the reason why civil society and these various small movements are allowed to persist is because you have to consider what happens if you don't give some sort of outlet. And so there is a difficulty in trying to monitor and trying to keep civil society under wraps. But there's also a lot of theories that look at you have to provide for these small little safety valves to allow a little bit of steam to come off. Because if not, the pressure cooker will come and it will expand so tightly, then you'll have a massive explosion. And so the idea is you have to allow for, in small doses, little voices to be able to be heard. But with all of this in place, we still have to consider, how does this authoritarian story come back in? Right. So as we look from 2012 and beyond, what the state has done is provide for increasingly smaller spaces and outlined a number of different parameters in which civil society cannot thrive. And so when you look at the number of what we might consider to be national security laws, and national security meaning to protect regime stability, there's quite a number of them in a very short succession. So the counter-espionage, the national security law, the counterterrorism law, and cybersecurity law all provide kind of free rein, again, for what might be considered threats to national interest, for the state to be able to seize property, seize assets, to basically harass and interrogate individuals who might be part of the problem under these particular laws. The last two, though, are actually quite interesting, because what they do is they give a space in particular for different kinds of NGOs. The charity law deals with domestic NGOs, and the foreign NGO law, by title should be suggestive, deals with foreign NGOs. And what it's really designed to do is try to constrain, all of these are designed to constrain foreign influence, right? And again, to provide specific parameters in which individuals can exist. And so the charity law in particular regulates organizations and puts a variety of restrictions. So it starts by outlining a vague language on what the threats are to national security, and then that sort of vague language can be used then to crack down and to harass individuals. The second kind of problem you see with the charity law is that organizations have to register first as social organizations. And the social organizations have to have a parent organization that's willing to help sponsor them. This actually then ends up eliminating or reducing smaller grassroots organizations from forming and prohibits them from reaching the next stages. And so that's one of the problems that you see with the charity law, and what it's basically designed to do is try to put these different limits in. A third challenge that you find with the charity law involves expenses. And so the administrative expenses, and this gives you a sense of the specificity, the administrative expenses cannot exceed 10% of the operating expenses, which means you cannot have very many personnel. And so again, when you think about the challenges that exist in trying to operate an organization without having very many administrative expenses, I challenge many of you to look at various NGOs in the US otherwise and look at how large those administrative expenses are. Again, you put a lot of restrictions in place. There are also restrictions on fundraising, that they are not allowed to engage in public fundraising. Both foreign and domestic NGOs are not allowed to engage in public fundraising, which includes the use of social media as well as otherwise. And then they also use your social credit score. And so social credit score reporting is another aspect to ensure an element of transparency, which again keeps it quickly under the eye and thumb of the state. And so when you look at the different kinds of regulations that are in place, right, this gives us a sense of how the state has worked to constrain various elements of civil society. So what are the implications of all of this? When we look at the various challenges, what is the future of civil society under this new shade of authoritarianism? I'll explain the picture quickly because I do like the elements that give you a sense. So there's a lot of discussion about how the average Chinese citizen doesn't think so poorly about the social credit score in the ways that foreigners do. And that's because there are some benefits that you can get from it as well. So you might get preferred seating. It's sort of like a loyalty program when you think about it, like preferred seating, better interest rates on things. So there could be some possible advantages if you're a good, good law-abiding, financially responsible citizen. But the picture over there on the left is from one of the crosswalks in Shanghai. There's a very famous crosswalk. People that jaywalk can get their picture taken. And their picture taken then is put up on the screen, sometimes with your ID number. So it really is a sense of public shaming, right? You've broken the law, you've jaywalked, and so we're going to go ahead and put your picture up here as well. These elements, I think, are important for the second and third point that are up here, and that you have various components about China's modernization that are seen as very beneficial. So you look at China, and it is a global innovator when it comes to things like facial recognition. It is a global innovator in technology. If you look at the policies that it's forwarded, the Made in China 2025, to be a leader in various elements of technology or AI in a very short period of time. So when you couch what the state is doing in those terms, when you're trying to promote a sense of China's modernization, advancement, and development, you don't notice how those things could be used for other kinds of nefarious purposes. And so when we look at whether or not protests can be successful, we do see that there is civil society growing in numbers. We do see that there are civil society organizations growing in numbers. We do see that there are spaces for that to exist. We see that there is protest that is possible. But we see that that space is being increasingly constrained, and the types of issues are very limited. So when you put this all together, there are a variety of sort of warning signs. One is to be cautious about this increasing sense of authoritarianism. Two is to be cautious about the sort of blanket look at civil society and just looking at numbers and saying civil society is growing. And there's also concern for China as a model for other states to follow, right? China is the biggest, the most unique in a variety of ways, but serves as a model for other states. And I'd like to conclude with kind of I guess it's a fable about a frog in boiling water. So if you've never heard this, boiling water, you have a pot of boiling water, you throw a frog in, the frog is going to jump out, right? If you put the frog in the water and gradually heat the water up, you eventually cook the frog. And so the warning is, frog, the water is getting hot.
All right, our final presentation, Dr. Daniel Katz.
Good afternoon. This presentation is entitled The Potential and Pitfalls of Strategic Engagement in U.S.-China Relations. Here we see a recent visit by former Secretary of Defense James Mattis to Beijing in June of last year to address significant security issues between the U.S. and China. Strategic engagement is defined as peacetime defense diplomacy between nations that are actual or potential adversaries. The goal of strategic engagement is the establishment of instruments that allow otherwise adversarial states to manage their relations with the ultimate goal of diminishing the risk of interstate conflict and cultivating mutual understanding. The U.S. and China have participated in strategic engagement since the 1980s. The extensive modernization and increasingly expansive outlook of the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, coupled with the preeminent security position of the U.S. in the Asia-Pacific, have necessitated strategic engagement to mitigate the risk of conflict. The PLA has evolved from almost a purely ground force to a modern military with naval, air, nuclear, and cyber components. Given the increasingly competitive and confrontational security posture between the U.S. and China, as well as the ongoing presence of regional flashpoints such as the South and East China Seas, a nuclear North Korea, and continuing ambiguity regarding the status of Taiwan, this presentation will examine current and future prospects for U.S.-China defense diplomacy. Defense diplomacy has been defined as the peacetime cooperative use of armed forces and related infrastructure, primarily defense ministries, as a tool of foreign and security policy. For purposes of this presentation, strategic engagement is a subset of defense diplomacy, carried out between state actors that will not participate in all defense diplomacy activities due to their mutually competitive posture. The goals of defense diplomacy and strategic engagement are not identical due to the divergent nature of the relationship between the actors. Strategic engagement is also broader than strategic dialogue, since it sometimes goes beyond discourse to working-level contacts between defense attachés, educational visits, ship visits, and other activities. This is a list of defense diplomacy activities as distinguished from those that constitute strategic engagement. Of the following 10 defense diplomacy activities, the U.S. and China have performed at least several of these, which are bolded. Bilateral and multilateral contacts between senior military and civilian defense officials, appointments of defense attachés to foreign countries, contacts and exchanges between military personnel and units and ship visits, bilateral or multilateral military exercises for training purposes. The drivers of strategic engagement are threefold. Strategic engagement has been pursued as a tool for states to communicate their motives to a potential adversary, as well as to better understand their motives. States pursue strategic engagement since it is low cost and preferable to the alternatives, which are little to no communication, misunderstanding of motives, and greater potential for conflict. Strategic engagement that has well-defined objectives is conducted on a sustained rather than ad hoc basis, and has the active support of political leadership is more likely to be successful. And finally, the history of strategic engagement offers useful lessons from which contemporary policymakers can approach global security challenges. Although the specific actors and circumstances may change, recurrent themes emerge. Here we have a Beijing meeting in August of 2017 between former U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Joseph Dunford, and his Chinese counterpart, PLA Chief of the General Staff, General Feng Fenghui. We begin with an historical overview of U.S.-China security relations prior to the Tiananmen incident of 1989. From the time of President Richard Nixon's opening to China in 1972 until 1989, the U.S., Soviet Union, and China engaged in a pattern of triangular diplomacy commonly referred to as the Strategic Triangle. The Sino-U.S. relationship benefited both the U.S. and China as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. 1989 was a pivotal year in changing U.S.-China relations. Under Gorbachev, relations warmed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, diminishing America's need for a Chinese counterweight to the Soviets. Contemporaneously, however, the June 1989 Tiananmen crackdown in China led to a sudden and powerful deterioration in U.S.-China relations, whose effects are still felt to this day. High-level U.S.-China military contacts after Tiananmen did not occur until the 1993 visit to Beijing by Assistant Secretary of Defense Chas Freeman to restore high-level U.S.-China military contacts and dialogue. The Freeman visit created momentum that demonstrated the mutual desire by the U.S. and China to restart strategic engagement. The net impression of American-China experts is that strategic engagement serves the combined purpose of improving overall relations as well as deterrence. Strategic engagement aims to improve relations through increased familiarity with the counterpart security establishment in an effort to reduce mistrust. 2 decades of strategic engagement between the U.S. and Chinese militaries have produced a significant number of interactions between military personnel of the two countries, numerous dialogues, and several agreements of variable significance. On a positive note, despite contentious issues, most notably the lack of clarity and the ongoing controversy over Taiwan and disputes in the South China Sea, the U.S. and China have successfully avoided any direct military confrontation. Strategic distrust is particularly acute between the U.S. and China in the security arena. The U.S. distrusts the PLA due to perceived Chinese prioritization of assets directed at the U.S. military, as well as a lack of transparency on its capabilities, doctrine, and military plans. PLA distrust of the U.S. runs deep, stemming from continued U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, U.S. reconnaissance near the Chinese coast and in the South China Sea, and cultivation of U.S. security relationships with countries near China. The current disputes involving the islands of the South China Sea are a potential flashpoint for conflict due to the overlapping claims of multiple states in the region, as well as U.S. insistence upon maintenance of freedom of navigation and open sea lines of communication. The factors contributing to strategic engagement outcomes are as follows. Civil-military balance. Historically, the PLA has had a close association with politics in the PRC due to its role in the elevation of the Chinese Communist Party to power in 1949. In the 3 decades since Tiananmen, however, military representation in high-level political bodies has progressively declined, to the point that no PLA representative has served on the Politburo Standing Committee since 1997. There is a discernible clash in outlook between the Civilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or MFA, and the PLA regarding strategic engagement with the U.S. vis-a-vis Taiwan. U.S. arms sales to Taiwan have often elicited a cutoff in strategic engagement with the U.S. In these instances, the MFA has a propensity to get the military-to-military relationship back on track as soon as possible to avoid lasting damage. The PLA, however, does not perceive the value in restoring mil-to-mil contacts unless the U.S. reduces or ceases its arms sales to Taiwan. The U.S. and China continue to function with different governmental operating systems and frequently disparate regional goals. Quality of diplomatic interactions. The U.S. and China have engaged in a multitude of official Track 1, semi-official Track 1.5, and unofficial Track 2 dialogues. These have included the Track 1 Strategic and Economic Dialogue, or SNED, and Strategic Security Dialogue, SSD, which have been replaced by the U.S.-China Comprehensive Dialogue in 2017, as well as an array of Track 1.5 and 2 dialogues. Track 1.5 and 2 U.S.-China dialogues have provided an opportunity to explore issues in a candid manner. The ability to speak freely outside of a Track 1 setting can be beneficial by enabling participants to convey attitudes which can then filter upward to the official intergovernmental level. Quality of mil-to-mil interactions. These include the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, or MMCA, the 2014 Memorandum of Understanding, the Defense Consultative Talks, DCT, port ship visits, and direct interaction between the two navies. Unfortunately, there is a gross misalignment of objectives between the U.S. and China, impairing the quality of the mil-to-mil relationship. The U.S. values the mil-to-mil relationship as a means to improve relations between the two countries and garner stability in the region. By contrast, China historically has not prioritized the mil-to-mil relationship, perceiving its primary value as gleaning information and venting dissatisfaction with the U.S. Proof of the difference in perceived importance of U.S. China diplomacy is the fact that China has canceled military-to-military contacts on numerous occasions, while the U.S. has rarely canceled such contacts. Additionally, markedly different structure of the militaries of the two countries contributes to difficulties in establishing an effective mill-to-mill relationship. Now, though the mill-to-mill interaction between the U.S. and China has been poor, it does show signs of promise. Certainly, ship-to-ship visits and exchange of naval personnel have transpired with some regularity for many years. Recently, the Chinese have also participated to a limited degree in joint naval exercises. While China participated in 2014 and 2016 RIMPAC multinational Pacific naval exercises, they were recently excluded from 2018 participation by the U.S., which objected to Chinese militarization of land features in the South China Sea. Political impact. While mill-to-mill relations ideally should be insulated from the ebb and flow of political events, the U.S. and China have frequently found it difficult to compartmentalize the two. In the post-1989 period, there have been numerous delays or suspensions of U.S.-China military contacts in response to political and military incidents. In the last decade, suspensions of U.S.-China mill-to-mill ties by China have followed announcements of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. From the Chinese perspective, as stated by a PLA Major General, the U.S. is responsible for all of the downturns in U.S.-China military relations except for the Tiananmen incident. The numerous cancellations of mill-to-mill relations, mostly initiated by Beijing, demonstrate that China places strategic engagement at a low priority level, sacrificed readily for political considerations. Role of secrecy. Although brief summaries of diplomatic interchanges such as the SNED and the DCT are released to the public, many aspects of the MMCA, SSD, and Track 1.5 and 2 discussions remain private and confidential. While the goal of secret proceedings may be the promotion of candor to prevent potential backlash from domestic audiences in the U.S. and China, it is difficult to gauge the tenor of exchanges at these meetings. China regards itself as militarily inferior to the U.S. at this time and views transparency as a luxury of the more powerful state. China is eager to acquire as much intelligence as possible about the U.S. without disclosing its own military capabilities. Secrecy appears to be a necessary, though not sufficient, factor vis-a-vis strategic engagement efforts. There is value to discreet mill-to-mill engagement between adversaries, where more public civilian-led efforts are more likely to fail. So let's evaluate the results of U.S.-China strategic engagement efforts. The goal of strategic engagement is ostensibly to reduce the prospect of conflict between potential adversaries. Establishing a shared narrative with common purpose is conducive to productive strategic engagement. Nonetheless, despite decades of interaction, this has not been achieved between the U.S. and China. The analysis of U.S.-China strategic engagement has yielded ambiguous results. This critical bilateral relationship is an ongoing process with profound consequences for global peace and security. The military rise of China has accompanied its economic ascent, making China one of the most powerful militaries in the Asia-Pacific region. China has grown increasingly assertive in its military behavior, sparking concern among neighboring countries and the U.S. Since circa 2010, this issue has become particularly acute given provocative Chinese actions in the South China Sea. Elevated tensions in the region necessitate strategic engagement between the U.S. and China to build trust and open channels of communication. Skeptics within the U.S. regard the most serious problems separating the U.S. and China as sharply divergent core interests. The U.S. position is that it seeks a peaceful and stable Asia-Pacific, maintenance of freedom of navigation in the East and South China Seas, and security for regional allies. The Chinese position is that it seeks to maintain the stability of the Chinese Communist Party, achieve ultimate unification with Taiwan, and assert maximal control over the East and South China Seas. Many experts have emphasized a gross deficiency of trust as an impediment to successful strategic engagement between the U.S. and China. This has been termed strategic distrust. The U.S. regards the PLA as being secretive and non-transparent, directing its military buildup at the U.S. and its allies. Despite Chinese denials, the U.S. believes that China's goal is to become the hegemon in Asia. China, by contrast, is deeply suspicious of U.S. motives, feeling that the U.S. militarily is the de facto hegemon and will not relinquish its status to accommodate China's rise. While the U.S. has strong defensive alliances with regional countries, notably Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, China has challenged these countries based upon conflicting territorial claims. And while the U.S. has been leery of China's rise, China is determined to reclaim its position as the dominant power in Asia. Mistrust has been aggravated by confusing messaging from the U.S. of an American pivot or rebalance to Asia. China views this as a strategy of encirclement and containment. The U.S. and China have developed enormous economic ties, which have rendered them mutually interdependent. Despite this, strong economic interdependence is not a sufficiently effective deterrent to avert conflict. The current administration is focused on risk reduction and crisis prevention rather than cultivating mutual trust. The current U.S. policy, as espoused by an administration official, is as follows. The United States values senior leader dialogues with China as fora to discuss strategic intentions, reinforce the U.S. vision for the bilateral relationship as one characterized by transparency and non-aggression, and advance efforts to reduce the risk of miscalculation or miscommunication, and prevent and manage crises. These dialogues provide venues for the United States to affirm our commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific and engage China on building a peaceful, principled, and prosperous region. Maintaining dialogue helps ensure the U.S.-China relationship is constructive and results-oriented for the benefit of the region and the world. China's PLA reforms since 2015 have changed dialogue frameworks that both sides continue to address. There have been an extensive number of dialogues as well as defense diplomatic activities between the U.S. and China over the years. Though numerous policy actors have divergent opinions as to the value of these interactions, it is vital to maintain open lines of communication and attempt to resolve differences peacefully. Given the nationalistic impulses of both countries and the desire of each government to appease their respective populations, there is inherent value in keeping dialogues out of public scrutiny with a minimum of political interference. Both sides must redouble their resolve to bolster strategic engagement efforts, particularly given the presence of regional flashpoints such as the South China Sea, a nuclear North Korea, and continuing ambiguity regarding the status of Taiwan. The lessons learned from an analysis of strategic engagement efforts are important to elucidate the significant factors which must be focused upon to achieve a successful outcome and avoid conflict or even war. And that concludes my presentation. I look forward to your questions.
So now I'd like to invite our speakers up to deal with question and answer. Did you want to start us off? Do you have any questions from the audience? I see one up here.
Hi, I think this is for you. Can you comment on sort of the security state in Xinjiang?
Xinjiang?
Sorry.
Yep.
My pronunciation's horrible. I apologize. And whether or not your thought about that being a model for the rest of China, or them, because I've heard some various things and read some stuff on them rolling some of those features out elsewhere.
Well, the situation in Xinjiang is a little bit different only because it's specifically targeted towards the Uyghurs there. And then you also have the concentration of those individuals in that location. Not exclusively, but you have the concentration of individuals in that location. And so are you looking at just sort of the overall element of surveillance?
Yeah, the features of the surveillance state there, if you could talk about what that's like and whether or not that might be applied to the rest of China.
I think that's already applied to the rest of China. So if you look at the element of the surveillance state and the number of cameras that are around and the element of information tracking, even basic information tracking. So if you go to, and again, it's the things that we think is innocuous. So if you go and look at the ability to get toilet paper in some of the tourist areas in Beijing, it's facial recognition. So you put your face up to the camera and it spits out 6 pieces of toilet paper. And it won't let you get more toilet paper until you wait 20 minutes. So this becomes a way that it's so smart, even in distributing toilet paper, and this is almost a petty example, right? But you have the facial recognition, and it recognizes the points on your face, so you can't go back for another 20 minutes. So when you think about the surveillance state, it's more than just having cameras. It's about all of the ways that your data is being collected, and the use of various components of big data then to triangulate and to determine various things. To give you another example, one that's a little bit less trivial, is they did sort of a test run of looking at the facial recognition cameras I think it was in Guiyang, and they have everybody's information and biometrics because of the resident IDs. And so they did a fake APB out about an individual who had committed a crime, and based on the number of cameras that individual crossed, it took 6 minutes to be able to track down from the point of leaving one train station exit to walking through the city to be able to determine that was the individual, and to have police come and do a mock arrest. And so when you look at the surveillance state, it's more than just looking at it targeting a particular ethnic minority group in Xinjiang. It's about how these elements, this is where the frog is being boiled, right? That there are various elements about society that makes it seem very safe and secure. I would argue China's one of the safest places you could possibly go to, but that also are leading to concerns about how data might be used and collected. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I think that the element of the surveillance state is much more complex than just looking at how it's being targeted towards ethnic minorities.
I think we have a follow-up question here related to that.
Yeah,
Yes.
I have a similar question. So kind of in the same vein of this, talking about the social credit system you mentioned near the end of your presentation. Some of my own research in that area shows that the social credit system is very far from unified across the country. There are a variety of systems, some implemented by private companies like Alipay's, Chima Credit, some implemented by city and provincial governments, like the particular instance I'm thinking of in Rongcheng in Shandong province is an interesting example, particularly in the fact that they don't have a score necessarily. They have more of a private blacklist or a red list of people who've done good things, people who've done bad things. I'm curious how this relates to what you were talking about with the social credit system and rating different NGOs.
Groups, right.
Right. How does that scale across the entire?
So there isn't like a hard number. It's not like your actual credit score. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, we all have these different agencies that do an actual credit score. But it's more a matter of having transparency. And if there are problems, then you won't be able to do various things. So it's relying on a sort of self-reporting or using of various ways to triangulate what your social credit score. This information, or the parameters, are still relatively new, and they're not widely implemented. As we know with a lot of these new policies, the way that they're implemented across China varies tremendously because you just don't have the personnel to be able to do them and have that level of consistency. So when we really look at the ways that there are these small models that are being tested, similar to how China has undergone many of its reforms, right, to test them out, work out the kinks before there's some sort of massive rollout. And technically the social credit system has been in some variety since about 2013. And so when you look at, again, where we are now, we're just now starting to talk about it because there's more attention being paid to it for various ways that individuals can be punished.
Over here.
Could any of you talk to the FBI attention to Chinese scientists now and transfer of scientific information?
I can tell you a little bit about it because I've worked with our science and technology policy program and coming up with recommendations for the Trump administration, but also just civil society. And there's also scholars in Houston, legal scholars at U of H, who have focused specifically on the more recent efforts. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, you may have heard that there's a general sense that the Chinese society and has been spying on the United States and been directed to do that, and questions about who does this include, who are the participants in this. And this has also raised questions about technology, and in particular advanced technology being sent to China by researchers based here or students or something like that. So there have been all kinds of questions raised about it, and the FBI and Department of Justice recently has been focused on this. And for I would argue for very good reasons, in the sense that there have been very high profile cases of such theft occurring. But more recently, it's been extended to other federal agencies. And so the ones you may have heard about here in Houston would be the National Institute institutes of health, directing people in the medical center to, hey, you need to review all of the contracts, research contracts that you have, where scholars from mainland China or associated with China who have been working under federal government funding, but then also look at what funding they do in China and who is it for. And there's a perception, at least from the FBI and the Department of Justice, that they are double dipping or maybe sharing technology. It's not clear to me that that's actually what is entirely going on. There certainly is some of that going on, but if you look at some of the more recent cases with MD Anderson, I believe one of them was an epidemiologist, and so there's no technology transfer there, and we could only benefit by having researchers like that. So it kind of raises the general question of, whenever the FBI and Department of Justice has done this in recent years, not just under the Trump administration, it's been a blunt force instrument, and it seems to impact a lot of people and raise a lot of questions. And there are senior Trump administration officials who are saying, we just need to scale back on all ties, to China, including students, including exchange of scholars. But I also should point out that this is also matched by increasing hostility from the Chinese government towards foreign scholars. And the American government has been very welcoming of Chinese scholars and students historically. The Chinese government has been very, very restrictive in the research that scientists, and especially social scientists, can do in China. They welcome people working on technology issues, but they don't like people in humanities and social sciences who come in and ask questions that they don't like. So my sense, though, is that this is all going to be, over the years, negotiated more between the United States and China, and our current ambassador in China has been fairly aggressive, but rightfully so, in pushing back the Chinese government and saying, look, you want us to have Confucius Institutes, kind of soft power cultural diplomacy at American universities, but you won't allow us to have American institutes at Chinese universities. So he's been good at pushing back against that. Where it will all end up, I think, will also depend on what the next administration will be, and how much they want to continue these policies. But there definitely is, at the FBI, Department of Justice level, there's a sense that we need to crack down on this, and also to target individual Chinese scholars to send the message. So very recently, there's some very well-known Chinese scholars who do international relations, kind of bombs and rockets type international relations theory. And they were stopped at the airport on the way out of the country going back to China. An FBI agent said, can we see your passport? And they took their passport and crossed out the 10-year visa that they had. And they said, you can reapply for a short-term visa. And this caused a lot of discussion and some outrage amongst Chinese scholars. But I looked at it like, well, I've never gotten a 10-year visa because I do research on China. Chinese government would never give me a 10-year visa. So as bad as I feel for the Chinese scholars, it's also true. We need to go back to the notion of reciprocity. And in this sense, I actually end up agreeing with the Trump administration to some degree. Bob?
I'm a little bit concerned about the way Chinese government is described here, because it really isn't centralized. I mean, power is centralized in Beijing, but the local governments have a great deal of freedom of action and aren't really controlled particularly strongly. They're watched, but not controlled necessarily.
I think that's an excellent point. Carrie, did you want to add to that?
I mean, that's one of the reasons why we do see the success of various small civil society movements at the local level, because you do find that there's more interaction. There, again, distance from the center can be an impactive factor. So all of those things, I don't think any of us would disagree that that's true.
Okay.
So my question is really, how come the Spratly Islands are like such a hotly contested area? Like, are they a really strategic position in like the battle for the South China Sea?
Yeah, so the South China Sea issue it's really ongoing for the last several decades. It's heated up particularly in the last 10 years or so, but there are a number of reasons why the claimant states are vying for this particular piece of maritime real estate. There are projections that there's possibly oil and gas reserves in these areas, also projections of fishing stocks, but most importantly, it relates to their position along vital sea routes that are sources of commerce. So not only for energy, but also just general sea routes linking the region with the Middle East and beyond. And so the smaller claimant states in Southeast Asia have felt that they're at a quite a disproportionate disadvantage when it comes to negotiations with China. China's preferred to deal with these states on a bilateral basis, and Southeast Asian nations themselves and collectively via ASEAN have appealed to the United States to assist with either a mediation role or some sort of assistance with trying to broker negotiations with China. I mean, China's claims to the South China Sea are very expansive. As you saw on that map, it's referred to as the 9-dashed line and encompasses almost the entirety of the South China Sea, which has given the other claimant states very little scope for negotiation. There was a legal ruling through an international court, through a suit filed by the Philippines. The ruling was in favor of the Philippines, but China rejected the validity of that court's ruling. So we're still somewhat at a standstill. I mean, ASEAN continues to negotiate for a binding code of conduct so that all the countries that are using the waters of that region can have some sort of principles that they can look to and point to when they're operating ships. But it continues to be an issue that that really bedevils all of these countries and the United States.
Yeah, if you look at the track record of dictatorships, say since World War II, where a lot of them have failed, what's your prediction of China in short term, long term? Will it survive and will it implode? And what could be those trigger points that cause some
See, who can we stick with this one? I believe Dr. Carrie Leo Courier is well qualified to discuss this one.
Wow, predicting the fall of the Chinese regime, that's a pretty tall order. So it's quite interesting. There's a lot of strength to the way that the Chinese system is structured. So when you look at the centralized nature of the government and you look at the way that power is sort of collected and concentrated at the center, I would argue that it's a ways away. And so there's a lot of reasons why that's actually quite beneficial. And so one of the things that we also see that makes China unique is that it's managed to engage in this economic reform program with a strong state. And so there are a lot of features that make China so very unique. But one of the things that makes it unique and successful is that it's been able to manage various things. Now, this isn't great when we start looking at things like civil society, but it does give a sense that the state has managed to keep any element that would successfully challenge its legitimacy at bay. And so I would argue that you're probably not looking at a downfall of the communist regime or dictator, if you want to call it a dictatorship, that you're not looking at the downfall anytime soon as a result of a variety of different factors. You will see more challenges, and I think that's one of the ways that it's an interesting paradox between seeing a strengthened authoritarian state and yet also seeing these elements of protest or dissatisfaction that come from below. And so from an outsider view, it may seem like that's enough to topple the regime, but there are many ways that still seems to be very far away, in my opinion.
Over here.
Yes. Are there any credible factions within the party, the party organization or the Politburo, that are opposed and pose a credible threat to Xi, the centralization of power?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So there are factions, and so really, if you go through sort of the long understanding of the Chinese system and looking at the top levels of leadership, right? You had concentrated power under Mao, you had concentrated power under Deng Xiaoping. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao got their power by being appointed essentially by Deng Xiaoping. And so in that process, what outsiders don't pay attention to is that there are many of these smaller factions within the Communist Party, because both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao were relative rivals, right? Because you want to be able to basically populate the various organs with your own followers, but given that Jiang Zemin was to be succeeded by Hu Jintao, that you didn't have the ability for Jiang Zemin to amass his own sense of power underneath him because you had that secession process. So there are these smaller factions that exist. In fact, there's a lot of discussion, and we don't know all of the factions because we are not insiders in the system, and a lot of this is kept very quiet. But there's a lot of signs that there's trouble, and that's when you have various meetings that take a while and no real clear communiques develop. There's indication that there is a lack of consensus. The time since the last plenum, which was in 2018, February of 2018, it's been a long time. Usually the plenums occur like every 6-9 months or so. It's been a while since the last plenum, and there is reason to believe that that's because there were concerns about how to handle various issues regarding trade, how to handle various issues regarding some of the other domestic concerns. And so we don't know a lot necessarily about the various components, but there are these basic levels of factions that we know exist. And so even if you look at the population of the Politburo Standing Committee, the change from 9 to 7 and now talk maybe going from 7 to 9 is all a reflection of power in various factions. And so those things, take a long time to try to explain, but we do know that there are those elements there. Whether or not there's a real challenge to Xi Jinping remains to be seen, because what we do know is that there's no clear successor. This is true of authoritarian regimes in general, but even Xi Jinping was, a surprise in the sense that we didn't know who was going to come literally after who. And so with Xi Jinping, we don't necessarily have a sense of who will come afterward, and nobody's being groomed to replace him, particularly with the constitutional changes.
If I could ask kind of a follow-up question for Dr. Chuk, could you talk a little bit about changes in Hong Kong? Talking about whether it's polarization or new leadership, and there's a lot of people asking a lot of questions and about how much of the protests are caused by economic issues and how much more political issues. And you referred to some of this, and clearly a lot of it also has to do with what you're talking about is migration, and changes in boundaries and rights of citizens. Could you talk a little bit about how Hong Kong kind of fits within that broader question?
Thank you, Steve, for bringing me in. As you have learned from my presentation, I'm not a specialist in Hong Kong studies, so I could only offer my perspective as a person from Hong Kong myself, based on my observation as a Hong Kong citizen. Obviously, polarization is quite a serious issue in Hong Kong now, in which if you support the government, you will support the government until the end of the world. And the same stories goes to the side of the protester, in which that's impossible for us to compromise. We see there's no future for us to support the current regime in Hong Kong as well as those in Beijing. So polarization as such is becoming very structural, that it's very difficult for both sides to reach a compromise and to reach an agreement that maybe we can negotiate, but actually such kind of space has been disappearing very rapidly over the last few months. So some people say that maybe if you don't like to stay in Hong Kong, you can just immigrate. But the problem is for people like me who have no stake in Hong Kong, as some political leaders define the younger generations, we couldn't afford the housings in Hong Kong. We also are forced to work with a very low pay that could not give us a very good life in a place that is very expensive to live in Hong Kong as ordinary citizens. So while at the same time, migrations is costly, not only in the economic sense, but also in the political sense. Hong Kong actually is very interesting to look at the Hong Kong population at the moment. They are not so transnationally connected like the diasporic groups that we have learned in the global history, especially for those people who were born and raised in Hong Kong in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Those people, they were very local to Hong Kong. And so now they are not quite considering that maybe we don't like the current regime, we just move out. It is almost quite impossible to them. Number one, they don't have enough capital to move out. And number two, politically speaking, they also have built up a very strong identity with the whole Hong Kong society. which is quite different from the previous generations of the Hong Kong populations. So in a way, I think polarization still goes on. It seems like it's a deadlock. And I think continuous observation is very important, while at the same time, yeah, I think it's very difficult for both sides to reach a compromise because, as Steve just mentioned, the polarization is very serious. And I will argue that it is becoming so structural that it's very difficult for both sides to come up with an agreement that we can solve the problem. I think it's quite impossible now, though.
Right, thank you. Maybe in the back, or there?
So turning to the other side, I'm curious what you all think about the situation with Taiwan. You know, obviously there's some real serious challenges there, and I'm particularly interested in where you see U.S. relationship going with them. You know, China's been out there peeling off all the support systematically from many countries, their support of Taiwan. And, you know, pretty soon Taiwan's going to be last man standing out there with U.S.'s support. And, you know, I think back to the Relations Act, but then you look at the U.S. hasn't been such a good friend of, you know, for example, you look at Ukraine and Crimea, and we didn't stand by the Budapest memorandum. So I'm just sort of curious where you see us going relative to Taiwan.
I would say, yes.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Oh, yes, please. I can happy to speak to it from the military security perspective. I would just say the current administration's a bit more forward-leaning in terms of its outreach to Hong Kong and upgrading some of the visits and the people we've been interacting with. I think it's it's important, I guess, as elections come up in Taiwan in January to see it's looking likely that the incumbent will remain in power, and to see, because of Beijing's dissatisfaction with with the current administration, to see how that impacts the relationship going forward. I think they're very serious concerns. I think particularly what Dr. Courier was mentioning about the statements at the recent plenum and the importance of keeping territorial integrity and with Hong Kong and also with Taiwan aspirations. So I think it's a great concern. It's something that continues to be something I think that the U.S. military views with a lot of with great interest, obviously, because of the buildup of forces across the strait and what the implications of that might be coming to the aid of Taiwan in a contingency. But at the moment, things seem to be fairly stable, at least on the military security front.
I also can just add a little bit that kind of historically, one of the reasons why Hong Kong was promised that it would be able to maintain its system for so many years was the idea that would be to lure Taiwan, basically, to lure Taiwan into coming back and working with the mainland. And if you look at public opinion polls in Taiwan, it seems to be not working in the sense that very, very few people are seeing that this is a good thing. Even the KMT, the Kuomintang Party, which has historically been very much, we need to work together with mainland China. This is a big problem in their elections coming up, is how do they claim that, yes, we want to be constructive with China when most of the people in Taiwan are saying, see, look what happened to Hong Kong. And so, here?
In the 90s, with the opening to China and so on, it was the idea that China will follow the path of South Korea, Taiwan, from dictatorship to democracy. Now, China is so much bigger than any of those countries. So is that sort of one of the reasons why they could say, we're going to do what we want to do? And then they're building their own sort of soft power outreach, the Belt and Road or whatever initiative. The soccer stadium in San Jose, Costa Rica was built by the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Either of you want to comment on like Belt and Road Initiative? We have a wonderful blog piece from our scholars at the Baker Institute China Studies program on this. But just in general, I've often cautioned people. I actually gave a presentation at the Department of Homeland Security Trade Bureau recently where I had to warn them. I said, be careful that a lot of things that Beijing talks about as a done deal and something that came from them usually is not the case. And in this case, the Belt and Road Initiative is something which is touted as Beijing is trying to reach out and reestablish, old ties, but then also build new ties and be a rival superpower to the United States, when actually it's much more likely that what's happened with the Belt and Road Initiative is this is Xi Jinping's effort to try to centralize and to bring under Beijing's thumb all of the initiatives of local governments, state-owned corporations, which just naturally reach out to the rest of the world. And so China needs all these minerals and resources in order to keep developing its economy. It needs experts, it needs markets. And so China's local governments, and we think of local governments as small potatoes, but the government of Shanghai, the government of Beijing, a lot of these governments, they are the equivalent of small European countries in terms of the amount of resources that they can devote. And they have very large universities and very large research and development budgets. And then these corporations that they also manage by even the local governments, if they see that there's an opportunity they can exploit some tie to go in another part of the world, they'll do it. And so Xi Jinping has realized that this also relates to corruption, as these local governments and state-owned enterprises try to move overseas to get resources, including currency, away from Beijing, where it can be taxed and it can be controlled. So it's part of the anti-corruption effort as well. And so part of that whole thing is to convince everybody that Beijing is totally running the show. And we need to be mindful on our side that that's usually not the case. And historically, this isn't the case. It's more about Beijing trying to establish control more than anything else. And it's also, by the way, not putting a lot of money on the table. It's trying to get other people around the world to cough up their money and get them to dedicate it in a way that they think will be strategically useful for China. So there's that. I think you had your hand up.
Katz, what's in it for China, too, with North Korea? What do they get out of defending the dictator with 6 nuclear weapons on the border? I mean, I can't understand why they would support this man, because their sanctions on them would bring the downfall of this government or close to it. What do they gain out of it?
It's a good question. I mean, it's a very challenging situation for China. I mean, they obviously have a historical relationship with North Korea. They fought with them during the Korean War, and also there's the geopolitical value potentially of having North Korea as a buffer state. On the other hand, Chinese scholars and security officials emphasize that the nuclear weapons on their doorstep present a threat to the Korean Peninsula and to the world. And so they weigh these competing interests. They've maintained the relationship, but it's unclear whether China exerts the kind of influence on North Korea that we would like, in the sense that China has issued their proclamations and said we wish you would not conduct these tests or do these sorts of military activities, and North Korea continues unabated. And so they wield significant influence in terms of they have an audience in North Korea, but I think they share some of the same concerns that the U.S. and the rest of the international community does about the threat that North Korean nuclear weapons pose for global security. And in the absence of the convening function that they played in the six-party talks, I mean, we've been left to largely these bilateral interactions, or some of the facilitating role that the South Koreans have played. But we continue to see at least low-level tests, and we really haven't figured out a solution for how to deal with the North Korean regime. It's a very, very challenging problem.
You have time for just a couple more questions, maybe another one from our student.
So if China doesn't address its aging demographic through immigration, how long until they begin to kind of see the effects of that demographic in terms of their economy?
Thank you for the questions. According to some demographers, it will be 2030. in which suddenly you have a rapid increase of the aging group, in which you have very little number of young generations. So it become quite unsustainable. As some demographers said that by 2030, China would not be able to sustain its economic and social development if she doesn't take immigration from outside. But of course, it is debatable because some people will say that it's like 2040, 2030, but most of the scholars argue that 2030 will be a critical mark that we all should pay attention to in terms of in terms of these particular issues. Thank you.
Maybe one more? Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. 您们都是你说话非常非常好。我有一个问题 I'd like to speak about what I see as the cognitive dissonance between cultures based on time and individuality. I think if you look at the course of the last 18 dynasties in China, 14 of them have endured longer than our fragile experiment, which is our democracy. My question with respect to the cognitive dissonance, the societal dissonance, the political dissonance between our culture and the Chinese culture, which is a Chinese civilization which has spanned thousands of years, is time and individuality. Would the panel please speak to the concept of the sacrifice of the individual in China for the collective good, and also the concept of a long-term concept with respect to dealing with anything, really. My friends in China don't think on a quarterly cycle, they think in terms of generations. Those are my two questions, time and individuality. Thank you.
If anybody has some comments, then yeah. Probably relates most to like political culture, but also generational change as well. And also kind of like transnational movements of populations and shifting social norms.
There's a lot of interesting literature that talks about sort of a collective identity, and it's hard to talk about China because it's got such a long history. So there are those that argue that there's a Confucian culture element that puts the collective over the individual, right? So there's this effort at harmony, and those are things about Chinese society or a lot of Asian societies that help explain a variety of things about them, whether it's economic development or any element of political culture, economic culture, or sacrifice for the whole. And then you can also make the argument that that was erased in the post-49 era, and what you have is that communism has replaced that, the emphasis on the collective as opposed to the individual. So you're really mixing two different elements of time, which is still very different from how we in the West necessarily look at things, right? So I think a lot of times when we're studying China, it's important to try to understand what the Chinese mindset is and the Chinese perspective, because it gives us a better way to communicate and figure out how to negotiate and understand our friend or adversary, or however you would like to phrase it. But I think it's a difficult element of looking at even just the basic element of collective versus individual, because you have such a long period of time and there are all of these influences that shape it.
Dr. Chuk, some other thoughts from our anthropologists?
So I will answer this question as migration studies scholars. In China, I think one of the arguments strongly held by academics and policymakers, not all but some, is that why we have such a rapid economic development over the last 10, 20 years. Internal domestic migration have played a very influential role, in which internal migrants from the village to the city has offered cheap labors, which have become the key driver for rapid industrialization all around China, not necessarily in the coastal part of China, but also in many inland parts of China. So migration as such has played a very important role, economically speaking and socially speaking. And scholars try to argue that the government should recognize this kind of factor when they are talking about how Chinese development has come into being. While at the same time, this kind of argument is not so well received by the Chinese government at the moment. I think if that kind of discourse or this kind of narrative has been recognized more openly by not only among people in the civil society, but also by people in the Chinese government. I think maybe that we will have a more positive narrative to describe the positive implications of migration, not necessarily those in terms of internal domestic migration, but rather, and increasingly important in the future, is the international labor migration as well. So, short answer to your questions.
What we're seeing today is a Chinese dynasty with 21st century characteristics. If you look at the past 20 centuries, 18 of those centuries, China had the highest GDP. So this reemergence is not a surprise to me. If you read history, China, we're just deja vu all over again. We're just seeing a reemergence of a Chinese dynasty from 21st century characteristics.
Very interesting. I think the gentleman behind you has been very patient with this. This will be our final question.
This is kind of a global question. You have an authoritarian regime that has a lot of little room for civil society and freedoms. You have even though democracies like in the U.S. and Europe have, their flaws. The question is, on the innovation standpoint, a lot of the innovation comes from, diverse groups. All the studies, academics says if you have a diverse group, you'll have more success in innovation. Where does that whole innovation drives economic development? So, from that perspective, is there from the Western, Western civilization compared to China, where does that stack up over the next long-term 50 to 100 years on innovation if you have an oppressive society there, I wouldn't think I would move there, but anyway, the more oppressive authoritarian compared to the more liberal and more open society as far as innovation and economic progress. Where does that leave us?
Very good question. Anybody want to tackle that one?
I would question, so innovation in what area? So if you're talking about innovation in technology, if you're talking about innovation economically, then there are a lot of ways that actually works very well with the authoritarian regime, because they can channel various resources to areas they would like to see develop. So the Made in China 2025 is a good example. You can look at the development of green energy sectors, which the government put a lot of effort into post 2009 and 2012. And so these are areas, for economic growth and development that you might make the argument that there's a lot of investment specifically by the state, which is easier to do when it's part of the state's grand strategy, really, of their domestic economic development. And that economic development is required in order for the regime to maintain a sense of legitimacy. If the state stops performing economically for its citizens, that's when you're really going to have a problem. And so those things, I think, are connected. But in terms of thinking of innovation in political thought or innovation in, independent critical thinking, that one's a little bit more difficult to have with an authoritarian regime. And so I think the question on economics, so it works quite well.
All right, well, this is a good time, I think, for us to adjourn to outside, have some refreshments, and maybe chat informally. But thank you, and thank our presenters, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah.